Welcome back, Mitchell Mustangs, on this Tuesday, May 19th. Thank you so much for watching another video. So, we are really coming to the end of this book. We only have a few more days, and definitely throughout the book, I'm always following the characters. We've talked about that. We've talked about how some characters are dynamic, is an academic word that we like to use, meaning dynamic. The character really changes, evolves. Some characters are static, stay the same. And it's good for us to be aware that authors intentionally create and craft their characters. And we talked about this in Charlotte's Web, how Avery stayed the same. And that helped us to see how much his sister had changed. When we read The Thief of Always, Harvey, at the beginning of the book, I have to admit, I didn't like him. I didn't like him at all. And then by the end of the book, I loved Harvey. I was cheering for Harvey because he changed so much. He grew into the type of person that I want to be. He was brave and courageous and took care of the others when they needed someone to be their hero. And the characters of Jive, remember those different characters of the house? They stayed the same. They were terrible from beginning to end, and that helped us, I think, to cheer on Harvey and appreciate him much more because of his changing. So as we're reading and coming to a close, I'm really thinking about how Stanley is such a dynamic character. In the beginning, lots of things seemed to happen to Stanley. Lots of things were just the way they were. He was made fun of at school and nobody helped him. He caught those shoes and was wrongly sent to Camp Green Lake, and it just was the way it was, and possibly because of his dirty, rotten, great so-and-so grandfather. But now, so much has happened. And we can't even talk about everything that's happened. I hope that you're talking about this holes with your friends, just like we talked about the ping pong back and forth, because there's so many things to talk about in this book. But Stanley now is someone who I admire. In the beginning, I felt sorry for Stanley. Now I want to be like Stanley. And I want to be a better friend because Stanley inspires me to do things that you know have to be done. And that is how we can form deep friendships, to help people when they need help. And notice how sometimes characters come in the book and we don't really hear too much about them, and we have to suspend our thinking and we have to wait to see if the character comes back and then form some opinions about this character. And whereas in this book, I think the warden's not changed. The warden is the antagonist. She is the problem. And Stanley is the protagonist. And so we are cheering him on. So as you read your independent reading books, there are predictable structures. There are predictable things that happen inside of fiction books. And we know the plot structure. We've talked about it. And we haven't reached the climax yet. I'm so waiting, and we'll start reading in just a minute. But also knowing that some characters evolve and change, and we look for that, and some characters stay the same. And we fall in love with some characters where we just think, oh my goodness, that's who I want to be. I want to be just like that character. Or we might start to think to ourselves, I think maybe I could be more like that character. Or I do not want to be like that character at all. I'm going to be careful of those types of behaviors. So let's get reading. Let's keep reading on, following these characters, and think about who we really are cheering on and admire and who we don't. All right, we left off in the middle of a chapter. where it said he just felt scared. The next morning, they headed down the mountain. They'd dunked their caps in the water hole before putting them on their heads. Zero held the shovel, and Stanley carried the sack, which was crammed with onions and the 3 jars of water. They left the pieces of the broken jar on the mountain. "This is where I found the shovel," Stanley said, pointing out a patch of weeds. Zero turned and looked up toward the top of the mountain. "That's a long way." "You were light," Stanley said. "You'd already thrown up everything that was inside of your stomach." He shifted the sack from one shoulder to the other. It was heavy. He stepped on the loose rock, slipped, then fell hard. The next thing he knew, he was sliding down the steep side of the mountain. He dropped the sack, and the onions spilled around him. He slid into a patch of weeds and grabbed onto a thorny vine. The vine ripped out of the earth, but slowed him enough so that he was able to stop himself. "Are you all right?" Zero asked from above. Stanley groaned as he pulled a thorn out of the palm of his hand. "Yeah," he said. He was all right. He was worried more about the jars of water. Zero climbed down after him, retrieving the sack along the way. Stanley pulled some thorns out of his pant legs. The jars hadn't broken. The onions had protected them like styrofoam packing material. "Glad you didn't do that when you were carrying me," Zero said. They'd lost about a third of the onions, but recovered many of them as they continued down the mountain. When they reached the bottom, the sun was just rising above the lake. They walked directly toward it. Soon they stood on the edge of a cliff, looking down on the dry lake bed. Stanley wasn't sure, but he thought he could see the remains of the Mary Lou off in the distance. "You thirsty?" Stanley asked. "No," said Zero. "How about you?" "No," Stanley lied. He didn't want to be the first one to take a drink. Although they didn't mention it, it had become a kind of challenge between him and Zero. They climbed down into the frying pan. It was a different spot from where they had climbed up. They eased themselves down from one ledge to another and let themselves slide in other places, being especially careful with the sack. Stanley could no longer see the Mary Lou, but he headed in what he thought was the right direction. As the sun rose, so did the familiar haze of heat and dirt. "You thirsty?" Zero asked. "No," said Stanley. "Because you have 3 full jars of water," said Zero, "I thought maybe it was getting too heavy for you. If you drink some, it will lighten your load." "I'm not thirsty," said Stanley. "But if you want a drink, I'll give you some." "I'm not thirsty," said Zero. "I was just worried about you." Stanley smiled. "I'm a camel," he said. They walked for what seemed like a very long time and still never came across the Mary Lou. Stanley was pretty sure they were heading in the right direction. He remembered that when they left the boat, they were headed toward the setting sun. Now they were headed toward the rising sun. He knew the sun didn't rise and set exactly in the east and the west, more southeast and southwest, but he wasn't sure how that made a difference. His throat felt as if it was coated with sandpaper. "You sure you're not thirsty?" he asked. "Not me," said Zero, his voice dry and raspy too. When they did finally take a drink, they agreed to do it at the same time. Zero, who was now carrying the sack, set it down and took out 2 jars, giving one to Stanley. They decided to save the canteen for last, since it couldn't accidentally break. "You know I'm not thirsty," Stanley said as he unscrewed the lid. "I'm just drinking so you will." "I'm just drinking so you will," said Zero. They clinked the jars together, and each, watching the other, poured the water into their stubborn mouths. Zero was the first to spot the Mary Lou, maybe a quarter-mile away and just a little off to the right. They headed for it. It wasn't even noon yet when they reached the boat. They sat against the shady side and rested. "I don't know what happened to my mother," Zero said. "She left and never came back." Stanley peeled an onion. She couldn't always take me with her, Zero said. Sometimes she had to do things by herself. Stanley had the feeling that Zero was explaining things to himself. She'd tell me to wait in a certain place for her. When I was real little, I had to wait in small areas like on a porch step or a doorway. Now don't leave here until I get back, she'd say. I never liked it when she left. I had a stuffed animal, a little giraffe, and I'd hug it the whole time she was gone. When I got bigger, I was allowed to stay in bigger areas, like stay on this block or don't leave the park. But even then, I still held Jaffe. Stanley guessed that Jaffe was the name of Zero's giraffe. And then one day, she didn't come back, Zero said. His voice sounded suddenly hollow. I waited for her at Laney Park. Laney Park? Said Stanley. I've been there. You know the playscape? Asked Zero. Yeah, I've played on it. I waited there for more than a month, said Zero. You know that tunnel that you crawl through between the slide and the swinging bridge? That's where I slept. They ate 4 onions apiece and drank about a half a jar of water. Stanley stood up and looked around. Everything looked the same in all directions. When I left camp, I was heading straight toward Big Thumb, he said. I saw the boat off to the right, so that means we have to turn a little to the left. Zero was lost in thought. What? Oh, okay, he said. They headed out. It was Stanley's turn to carry the sack. Some kids had a birthday party, Zero said. I guess it was about 2 weeks after my mother left. There was a picture and there was a picnic table next to the playscape, and balloons were tied to it. The kids looked to be the same age as me. One girl said hi to me and asked me if I wanted to play. I wanted to, but I didn't. I knew I didn't belong at the party, even though it wasn't their playscape. There was this one mother who kept staring at me, like I was some kind of monster. Then later, a boy asked me if I wanted a piece of cake, but then that same mother told me, "Go away!" And she told all the kids to stay away from me. So I never got the piece of cake. I ran away so fast, I forgot Jaffe. Did you ever find him? It? For a moment, Zero didn't answer. Then he said, he wasn't real. Stanley thought again about his own parents and how awful it would be for them to never know if he was dead or alive. He realized that was how Zero must have felt, not knowing what happened to his own mother. He wondered why Zero never mentioned his father. Hold on, Zero said, stopping abruptly. We're going the wrong way. No, this is right, said Stanley. You were heading toward Big Thumb when you saw the boat off to the right, said Zero. That means we should have turned right when we left the boat. You sure? Zero drew a diagram in the dirt. Stanley still wasn't sure. We need to go this way, Zero said, first drawing a line on the map and then heading that way himself. Stanley followed. It didn't feel right to him, but Zero seemed sure. Sometime in the middle of the afternoon, a cloud drifted across the sky and blocked out the sun. It was a welcome relief. Once again, Stanley felt that destiny was on his side. Zero stopped and held out his arm to stop Stanley, too. Listen, Zero whispered. Stanley didn't hear anything. They continued walking very quietly, and Stanley began to make out the faint sounds of Camp Green Lake. They were still too far away to see the camp, but he could hear a blend of indistinct voices. As they got closer, he occasionally could hear Mr. Sir's distinctive bark. They walked slowly and quietly, aware that sounds travel in both directions. They approached a cluster of holes. Let's wait here until they go in, said Zero. Stanley nodded. He checked to make sure there was nothing living in it. Then he climbed down into a hole. Zero climbed into the one next to him. Despite having gone the wrong way for a while, it hadn't taken them nearly as long as Stanley had expected. Now, they just had to wait. The sun cut through the cloud, and Stanley felt its rays beating down on him. But soon more clouds filled the sky, shading Stanley in his hole. He waited until he was certain the last of the campers had finished for the day. Then he waited a little longer. As quietly as possible, he and Zero climbed up out of their holes and crept toward camp. Stanley held the sack in front of him, cradled in his arms, instead of over his shoulder, to keep the jars from clinking against each other. A wave of terror rushed over him when he saw the compound, the tents, the rec room, the warden's cabin under the 2 oak trees. The fear made him dizzy. He took a breath, summoned his courage, and continued. "That's the one," he whispered, pointing out the hole where he had found the gold tube. It was still about 50 yards away, but Stanley was pretty sure it was the right hole. There was no need to risk going any closer. They climbed down into the adjacent holes and waited for the camp to fall asleep. So I'm thinking about Stanley. In the beginning of the book, he didn't seem like a person who would go after things that he wanted. He just let things happen, shrugged his shoulders. He just ended up at Camp Green Lake. Now he is on a mission. He has saved Zero. He's going to maybe find the treasure. He's a totally evolved person. I think he always had a good heart, but now I think he's the best version of himself. I'm cheering him on. Zero too. Zero's definitely a dynamic character, and I love learning his backstory. Mrs. Clifford talked about that, about hearing this story being told through different perspectives. I do love the pieces are unfolding because it makes me always want to hear a little bit more about Zero. Let's keep reading just a little bit more. Chapter 44. Stanley tried to sleep, not knowing when he'd get the chance again. He heard the showers and, later, the sounds of dinner. He heard the creaking of the rec room door. His fingers drummed against the side of the hole. He heard his own heart beat. He took a drink from the canteen. He had given Zero the water jars. They each had a good supply of onions. He wasn't sure how long he remained in the hole. Maybe 5 hours. He was surprised when he heard Zero whispering for him to wake up. He didn't think he had fallen asleep. If he had, he thought it must have been just for 5 minutes, although when he opened his eyes, he was surprised to see how dark it was. There was only one light on at camp in the office. The sky was cloudy, so there was very little starlight. Stanley could see a sliver of a moon, which appeared and disappeared among the clouds. He carefully led Zero to the hole, which was hard to find in the darkness. He stumbled over a small pile of dirt. "I think this is it," he whispered. "You think?" Zero asked. "Isn't it?" said Stanley, sounding more certain than he really was. He climbed down. Zero handed him the shovel. Stanley stuck the shovel into the dirt at the bottom of the hole and stepped on the back of the blade. He felt it sink beneath his weight. He scooped out some dirt and tossed it off to the side. Then he brought the shovel back down. Zero watched for a while. "I'm going to try to refill the water jars," he said. Stanley took a deep breath and exhaled. "Be careful," he said, and then he continued digging. It was so dark he couldn't even see the end of his shovel. For all he knew, he could be digging up gold and diamonds instead of dirt. He brought each shovelful close to his face to try to see if anything was there before dumping it out of the hole. As he made the hole deeper, it became harder to lift the dirt up and out. It was 5 feet down below. It was 5 feet deep before he even started. He decided to use his efforts to make it wider instead. This made more sense, he told himself. If Kate Barlow had buried a treasure chest, she probably wouldn't have been able to dig much deeper. So why should he? Of course, Kate Barlow probably had a whole gang of thieves helping her. You want some breakfast? Stanley jumped at the sound of Zero's voice. He hadn't heard him approach. Zero handed down a box of cereal. Stanley carefully poured some cereal into his mouth. He didn't want to put his dirty hands inside the box. He nearly gagged on the ultra sweet taste. They were sugar frosted flakes, and after eating nothing but onions for more than a week, he had trouble adjusting to the flavor. He washed them down with a swig of water. Zero took over the digging. Stanley sifted his fingers through the fresh piles of dirt in case he had missed anything. He wished he had a flashlight. A diamond no bigger than a pebble would be worth thousands of dollars, yet there was no way he'd see it. They finished the water that Zero had gotten from the spigot by the showers. Stanley said he'd go fill the jars again, but Zero insisted that he'd do it instead. No offense, but you make too much noise when you walk. You're too big. Stanley returned to the hole. As the hole grew wider, parts of the surface kept caving in. They were running out of room. To make it much wider, they would first have to move some of the surrounding dirt piles out of the way. He wondered how much they had before the camp woke up. How's it going? Zero asked when he returned with the water. Stanley shrugged one shoulder. He brought the shovel down the side of the hole, shaving off a slice of the dirt wall. As he did so, he felt the shovel bounce off something hard. What was that? Asked Zero. Stanley didn't know. He moved his shovel up and down the side of the hole. As the dirt chipped and flaked away, the hard object became more pronounced. It was sticking out of the side of the hole about 1.5 feet from the bottom. He felt it with his hands. What is it? Asked Zero. He could just feel a corner of it. Most of it was still buried. It had the cool, smooth texture of metal. I think I might have found the treasure chest, he said. His voice was filled with more astonishment than with excitement. Really? Asked Zero. I think so, Stanley said. The hole was wide enough for him to hold the shovel lengthwise and dig sideways into the wall. He knew he had to dig very carefully. He didn't want the side of the hole to collapse, along with the huge pile of dirt directly above it. He scraped at the dirt wall until he exposed one entire side of the box-like object. He ran his fingers over it. It felt to be about 8 inches tall and almost 2 feet wide. He had no way of knowing how far into the earth it extended. He tried pulling it out, but it wouldn't budge. Oh, Mitchell Mustangs. We're going to have to stop there. Oh my goodness. We'll be for sure to show up for tomorrow because I think that we are at the climax. I think that they have found something pretty important. So tune in tomorrow and let's keep reading. Mitchell Mustangs, I invite you to follow your characters, to think about why would the author choose to create and craft a character like this. I believe Louis Sachar created a character like Stanley to inspire us to take charge of our lives, to live our lives with purpose, and to be the best versions of ourselves. I think that he really is becoming the best version of himself. I think that Louis Sachar created a character like Zero for us to think about. There were a lot of things said about Zero, and possibly we could have just believed those things about Zero. We could think he wasn't very smart. We could think there wasn't much going on there. And now we're learning this whole story about Zero, and I really feel badly for Zero, but I feel like there's going to be a little hope here. I feel like these two characters have come from places where they're both evolving into a better version of themselves. And there's just a lot for us to think about these characters. So we're going to have to stop there. I'm sorry the video is just a little bit long today. The last thing I want to say to you, Mitchell Mustangs, stay healthy, happy reading, happy writing. Thank you. Can't wait to read on tomorrow.